They arrived in silence. No grand announcement, no diplomatic entourage, just a single human transport vessel drifting into orbit above the capital world of the Scythari Empire. At first, the Empire barely noticed. A backwater species from a distant blue planet had sent representatives. So what? The Scythari had seen thousands of species try to negotiate, plead, threaten. None had succeeded. The Empire did not bend, and certainly not to creatures as fragile-looking as humans. But the fear came quickly. It started in the Grand Council chamber, where the human delegation was first received. 5 of them walked in. No weapons, no armor, just simple formal wear and expressions that were calm, almost too calm. The guards posted at every entrance noted their posture, how they didn't flinch at the towering armored enforcers lining the halls. One diplomat even smiled, like he knew something the others didn't. That smile chilled the air more than any weapon ever could. For centuries, the Scythari Empire ruled through sheer force. They conquered worlds, shattered civilizations, and installed governors who answered only to the throne. They believed strength was the only language worth speaking. But humans didn't come speaking in strength. They came with questions. They came with stories. And they came with a warning. Negotiate peace, one of them said, or face what comes after. It was almost laughable. The room full of warlords and high command tried not to smirk. But something about the human's voice, it lingered, like an echo from a place that shouldn't exist. One of the senior tacticians reported having nightmares that same night, visions of cities crumbling, machines unlike anything in the archives, and something worse, silence. The kind of silence that only exists after complete annihilation. The Empire's intelligence division launched immediate scans. They scoured human records, their broadcasts, their data nets. What they found wasn't terrifying in the traditional sense. The humans weren't the strongest species. They didn't have the most powerful fleet. But what shook the analysts to their core was a pattern, an eerie trail of vanished empires, fallen alliances, and dead planets. Not wiped out by disease or invasion. No, these collapses all had one thing in common: human contact. It didn't make sense. How could diplomats, just envoys, leave behind that kind of destruction? But humans didn't conquer with armies, not anymore. They asked questions that made governments collapse. They offered ideas that sparked revolutions. They introduced philosophies that split entire cultures down the middle. And when resistance came, when violence was used to suppress what they had awakened, the humans didn't strike back with fire. They waited. Let time do what missiles could not. That was the terrifying part. And now they were here, on the capital world of the largest empire in the galaxy. No weapons, just words. The head of the council leaned forward, staring at the calmest of the humans across the table. "What do you want from us?" he asked. The human simply smiled again and said, "Only your attention." And that's when the lights cut out. Panic didn't break out right away. The Empire's security systems were built for redundancy, layered fail-safes that had never failed. So when the lights went dark in the Grand Council chamber, everyone expected them to flicker back on within seconds. But seconds passed, then minutes, and in the pitch black, something shifted. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a silence too deep, a pressure that seemed to settle over every chest in the room. The humans didn't move. That's what disturbed the guards the most. While everyone else reached for comms, for scanners, for reassurance, the 5 human diplomats stayed perfectly still, as if they'd expected this, as if it was all part of a larger plan. One of them whispered something in the dark. No one caught the words, but the tone, calm, almost amused, sent a jolt through the spine of the nearest enforcer. Then the backup lights snapped on. Dim, red, emergency only. But it was enough to see again. The humans stood exactly where they had been. Not a step forward, not a step back. But now, there was something different about their expressions. Not fear, not arrogance, something in between. like they were waiting for the inevitable to begin. Security systems across the capital world were failing, one after another. Doors wouldn't seal. Drones froze midair. Surveillance feeds turned to static. On the throne's command, an elite technician squad traced the issue back to a single anomaly, an unknown signal, quiet and embedded deep in the planetary grid. It had been planted weeks ago, hidden in harmless data transfers. And the source, according to the system logs, was Earth. The Empire had underestimated humanity from the start. Their first contact had been uneventful. A small trade agreement, basic cultural exchanges. But humans were listening, studying, learning. And while the Sithari saw them as harmless, humans were already inside the system, literally and politically. They had advisors in minor colonies. They had low-level access to communications networks. They had made themselves invisible, and that was the most dangerous kind of enemy. The humans didn't need fleets. They didn't need weapons. They had patience. They had ideas. And now, they had everyone's attention. Back in the chamber, the head of the council stood slowly. His voice was sharp, controlled, but the edge of fear was there. Is this some kind of threat? One of the humans stepped forward for the first time. He was older than the others, face lined with years, but eyes sharp and alive. "No," he said softly. "This is an opportunity. We're here to show you what comes next." "What does that mean?" The Sithari commander barked. "What comes next?" The human tilted his head slightly. "Change." The council members exchanged uneasy looks. Somewhere deep beneath the capital, a distant rumble echoed through the floor. Systems that shouldn't fail were collapsing like dominoes. Entire districts going dark. Communications with outer colonies were dropping. And somewhere in the noise, a simple message repeated across every channel. "Your time has ended. Make room for the new." And then, without warning, the sky over the capital cracked open. The sky didn't literally break open, but that's how it felt. Above the capital, dozens of satellites went blind at once. Orbital relays flickered and vanished. Entire fleets lost navigation mid-flight, spinning into chaotic formation, blind and deaf. The atmosphere buzzed with static as comms went dead across half the planet. No explosions, no ships descending, just silence and a sudden, eerie lack of control. In the chaos, the human diplomats were quietly escorted to a secure holding chamber. Not arrested, at least not officially. The Empire didn't want to admit fear. Not yet. But orders came from high command to isolate the humans, interrogate them, and find out what they had done, because clearly something was unraveling, and all signs pointed back to Earth. One of the younger diplomats sat calmly on the cold bench in the chamber, fingers tapping a silent rhythm on his leg. "They always think it's about weapons," he muttered. "They never learn." Meanwhile, deep in the intelligence towers, analysts scrambled to understand how the humans had bypassed firewalls that hadn't been broken in centuries. The Empire's AI systems, once considered flawless, were now glitching. Patterns in the code were surfacing, like fingerprints pressed into the very fabric of their infrastructure. Human fingerprints, subtle shifts, small changes, harmless at first, but over time, they added up to something that could rewrite the rules of control. While the High Command debated countermeasures, another threat was quietly rising. Whispers were spreading through the lower city sectors. Rumors that the humans weren't prisoners but messengers. That they had come to liberate, not destroy. Citizens, already restless under the weight of the Empire's strict order, began to listen. Some believed the humans had shut down the systems on purpose. Others believed the humans had simply revealed how broken the Empire already was. In the midst of it all, a Sithari intelligence officer named Kale began to suspect something far worse. He wasn't like the others. He had studied human philosophy before it was banned. He had read their histories, their revolutions, the strange pattern of collapse that seemed to follow in their wake. But Kale didn't believe they were warmongers. No, humans were something else. They didn't need war. They just needed an audience. The message that kept echoing, "Your time has ended. Make room for the new," wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration, a shift. Cal reviewed archived footage from old diplomatic missions. In every case, the humans were polite, patient, but always left behind questions. Doubt. And doubt, in a tightly controlled empire, was more dangerous than bombs. Back in the chamber, the lead human, older, sharper than the others, looked at the surveillance camera embedded in the wall, as if he knew Cal was watching. "We're not your enemy," he said calmly. "Not unless you make us one." Before Cal could respond, another alarm cut through the building. This time from the outer colonies. One of the frontier sectors had gone completely offline. No signal, no trace, not even debris. And just as the realization set in, Cal's screen flickered, then filled with a single line of text. "One by one, the lights will go out." Panic was no longer whispered. It was written across every face in the high command chamber, even if no one dared speak it out loud. Reports poured in faster than they could be read. Colony after colony falling silent. Outposts going dark with no signs of attack. No ships. No warnings. Just a slow, creeping silence that spread like a virus across the stars. Cal hadn't slept in over a day. The message still blinked on his console. "One by one, the lights will go out." It wasn't just poetic. It was a countdown. And now, even the inner sectors, the ones closest to the core systems, had begun showing signs of instability. Power grid anomalies, civil unrest, enforcer units overwhelmed in cities once thought unshakable. It wasn't just the humans doing. It was the ideas they planted. In the lower levels of the detention wing, the diplomats remained untouched. The Empire didn't dare harm them, not without knowing the consequences. But the guards had doubled, and the air felt heavier with every passing hour. The oldest human still carried that unreadable calm, like he knew something the others didn't. Or maybe they all knew, and just didn't care if the Empire figured it out in time. Back at the intelligence towers, a breakthrough came from a junior analyst. Barely more than a cadet. She found a buried thread in the archives. A former civilization called the Corellan Accord. Powerful, unified, efficient, until human contact. According to the records, they never went to war with Earth. They just changed. After human diplomats visited, half of the Corellan population began questioning their leadership. Within 2 years, their centralized control structure collapsed. Not from force, but from thought. Ideas that couldn't be unthought once heard. The Empire had dismissed that incident as coincidence. They couldn't ignore it now. Outside, the skies above the capital were shifting. Orbital platforms flickered erratically, and old satellites spun out of position. Civilian transports were grounded. Curfews were enforced with extreme precision, but the unrest kept growing. In the outer districts, crowds gathered in defiance, some calling for answers, others shouting about change. A message had started circulating among them. A human phrase, simple but powerful. "You don't need to be ruled." Cal watched it spread like wildfire. On walls, on comlinks, on airwaves. He tried to flag it as propaganda, but it was too late. It wasn't just spreading. It was believed. Back in the secure chamber, the lead human diplomat finally stood. No orders, no signals. He just stood, and the guards reached for their weapons out of reflex. "You can't stop what's coming," he said softly. "You've already heard it. You've already felt it. And soon, even your own will begin to wonder why they ever bowed to you in the first place." An emergency beacon lit up across the capital. An outer planetary fleet had just vanished mid-transit. No distress signal, no trace. And then, for the first time, the capital's central defense AI stuttered. The screen in Cal's office went black. Then a new message appeared, in human script. "The Empire ends tonight." The darkness that had descended over the Empire wasn't just a failure of systems. It was a reckoning. The silence wasn't an end. It was the beginning of something larger. The Empire, once so assured of its eternal power, now stood on the precipice of something it couldn't control. As the minutes ticked by, Cale sat frozen in front of his console. The message had been clear. The Empire ends tonight. And yet, no one could explain how. No weapons, no grand battle. Just ideas, seeds planted in the cracks of a once immovable system, now blossoming into something that would reshape everything. Even the most powerful fleets couldn't stop it. The Empire's vast armies and AI-driven dominance weren't enough when faced with the quiet power of belief. In the holding chamber, the human diplomats didn't seem worried. They stood together in quiet conversation, their eyes still carrying the weight of something unspoken. The oldest among them stepped forward again, his face serious but unshaken. "This is what happens," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet, "when the truth is seen. When the cracks become too wide to ignore." The guards shifted uneasily. They could see it now, couldn't they? The cracks. The way the Empire had stretched itself thin, always chasing after more control, more power, more worlds to subjugate. They had never once considered that the real strength didn't lie in control. It lay in choice, in freedom. And humanity, despite everything, had somehow reminded them of it. As the hours passed, the city fell into a strange quiet. The usual hum of power was absent. No more broadcasts, no more news. The streets were filled with crowds, at first hesitant, then emboldened. The message had spread. People were starting to ask questions. The questions that had never been allowed before. What if they didn't have to live under the Empire's rule? What if they had the power to change things themselves? Cale knew that the Empire's hold was slipping, but the question remained. Could they stop it now? Could they convince the people that the order they had fought so hard to maintain was worth preserving? It seemed unlikely. Too many were waking up. Too many were beginning to see the truth. And in that moment, Cale realized something that had been gnawing at him since the beginning. The Empire was never truly about power. It was about fear. The human diplomats were right. Fear wasn't enough to hold everything together. It was an illusion. And now that illusion was crumbling. In the days that followed, the Empire would never be the same. The transition was far from peaceful, but it was inevitable. Power structures that had lasted for millennia began to fracture, not from violence, but from the overwhelming force of people who dared to think differently. And among it all, the humans, once seen as insignificant, had catalyzed the change. Their quiet revolution, born of ideas, of understanding, had brought the Empire to its knees. But the true victory wasn't in the collapse of the Empire. It was in the awakening of a galaxy that realized, at long last, that they didn't have to live in fear, that they didn't have to be ruled. And as for Cale, he stood alone before the capital's towering walls, looking out at the crowds, feeling the weight of it all. He had been one of the last to see the truth. But even he couldn't deny it anymore. The lights were flickering back on, one by one. And this time, they weren't going out.